Stop.
Hey, Ben. So I'm definitely a left-leaning student, but I listen to your podcast every day.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my question is about race and culture. So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led to these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures, without taking into consideration historical, the history in general, conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here, but I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America, too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathologies that exist in the black community, black inner city community, of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem. You know, this is a general issue that I have in all of my relationships. When my wife comes to me and she says, there's a problem in my life, before we even have the conversation, I say to her, is this a listening conversation, or is this a you want me to fix it conversation? And I think that when it comes to politics, there should be far fewer listening conversations, like I want you to tell me about all the crap that's happened to you, because I don't care. I mean, I care, but it doesn't. But now the question is, what you going to do? Right? That's a much more important conversation, because we only have 5 minutes together. Is that 5 minutes going to be spent on all the terrible things that happened, which I fully agree with, that I would have fought if I were there, but I wasn't? Right? Are we going to spend 5 minutes talking about all the terrible things that happened to blacks and Jews and gays and women and Hispanics in the United States? Or are we going to talk about right now what you can do to succeed? Because I don't think that the rules are holding you back. So I've never, ever, at any point suggested that there's not been historic discrimination against black people, or even that current-day poverty is at least in part an outgrowth of that historic discrimination. What I have suggested is that if you are using that historic discrimination as a reason why you are not, as an individual human being, becoming more income mobile and not making good decisions, no one is making the call for you right now as an individual to get that girl pregnant. And that's the argument that I'm making. Sure, yeah.
So I guess, like, would you, like, so don't, would you have to admit, though, that between different races and different cultures, there are different levels of success, and there's definitely, you would expect that somebody who grows up with being able less to succeed, you would expect that would happen in certain communities and certain
right. That's why they're called
communities.
pathologies of culture. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you grew up in a worse situation than somebody else who grew up in a better situation, of course you're going to grow up having obstacles that other person has to overcome. But that doesn't mean that other person, number one, victimized you. Right? There's no one in America today, for example, who's enslaved a black person that I know of, or if they have, they'd be in jail. I'm sure that nobody in this room, right, none of the young white people in this room were alive during the times of Jim Crow. So the question is, do we take away from the white people in this room to rectify historic injustices, or do we recognize that history is filled with historic injustices, and now we're going to have to find a way to overcome those obstacles together without redistributing income, for example? Now, I have called for movements, for example, for companies to go into inner cities and make a deal with students in inner cities and say to them, listen, you get good grades and we'll pay for your college, and then you come afterward and you work for us for 3 years to pay off that debt. And I think there are things that we can do in the private sector. This is why I think religious communities are so important. I'm not against charity. I'm not against us as individuals going out and helping people. What I am against is the idea that the government can fix this problem, because the government cannot fix historic inequity. All that the government can do is set the rules at an equal level, equal law, equal judgment under law, equal justice under law, is the only way that we're ever going to approach anything that looks like a fair society. There's no such thing as a fair society where the government plays God and gives some to others and takes from others.
So, like, would you say that we should, like, other people who are not, in an oppressed state, they should wait for other people to pull themselves up? Do you think that's how we should solve it, or do you think there is a moral
I think every culture in
responsibility?
American history, every individual in American history who has succeeded has had a combination of people who help them out, not in the government, people who help them out, and their own capacity to bootstrap it. And when my great-grandparents got here, they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. Great-great-grandparents got here. They were dirt poor and didn't speak English. This is true for virtually everybody in the room, right? At some point, somebody came over here and they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. And that doesn't mean that on a generational level, people are going to go from 0 to 100. But it does mean that we're going to need to move in the right direction as opposed to sitting around and talking about historic injustice all day. Okay, fine. Okay, now let's get to the real gun violence statistics. So what we've been hearing is gun violence is constantly on the increase. People are being murdered on a scale that boggles the imagination. School shootings are increasing. And your child is, if not likely going to die, has a high likelihood of being shot at a school. This is not true. Okay, gun deaths in the United States have been radically declining since 1993. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there were 7 gun-related homicides for every 100,000 Americans in 1993. By 2013, that number had been sliced in half to 3.6 homicides per 100,000 population. During that same period, the number of privately owned firearms in the United States doubled, from 185 million to 357 million privately owned firearms in the United States. So the number of arms in the United States was going like this, and the amount of gun crime in the United States was going like that. And yet everybody in the media seems to assume that more guns means more crime. You're going to have to explain then why more guns does not mean more crime. Okay, where do all of these... also, quick note, they say there are 33,000 gun-related deaths in the United States. They neglect to mention that 2/3 of these are suicide. About 8,000, 9,000 gun-related homicides in the United States. The vast majority of gun-related deaths are people who are killing themselves. And it is very easy to substitute another method for killing yourself. Okay. Where do gun-involved deaths take place? So the idea from the left is that states that have lax gun laws have higher rates of gun crime. This is not true. Gun-involved deaths take place in mostly America's major cities. So all those hicks from the sticks, the people who actually own all the guns, those aren't the people who are killing each other. Okay, this is all happening in cities, in major American cities. Virtually all of these major American cities are governed by one party, and I will let you guess which party that is. Almost 60% of all American firearm homicides occur in the 62 cities of the country's largest metros. In order of gun homicide, gun-related death: New Orleans, Detroit, Las Vegas, Miami, Baltimore, St. Louis, Richmond, Memphis, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. That is 9 Democrat mayors and 1 Republican mayor, the only Republican being in Miami. The single strongest predictor of rates of gun death by a wide margin is actually race, unfortunately. Okay, Richard Florida writes, the share of the population that is black is positively related to both the overall rate of gun death and even more so with gun-related homicides. Now, let it be noted, I am not suggesting that black people are inherently more likely to kill each other, because that's stupid and racist. What I am suggesting is that culture has a high likelihood of causing homicide, and culture differs. Okay, you can look in poor white communities. There's a higher rate of homicide there as well. Cultural issues and poverty in major American cities factor into gun death. Guns are not the chief reason for gun death. In other words, you need bad people picking up guns in order for those guns to fire themselves. I have 2 guns at home. I have a 9mm and I have a shotgun. Neither one of them has killed anyone. Neither one of them has popped out of my safe and shot anyone. And neither one of them is going to, because it's my safe and I have the key. Okay, rifles versus handguns. People keep talking about banning rifles. The left is very focused on banning rifles, which is a really weird thing to do when you think about it, considering that rifles are not more dangerous than handguns. In 2014, there were 8,100 total firearm homicides. Fully 5,500 were committed with a handgun. 248 total were committed with a rifle. And so you're significantly more likely to die, if you're in a gun-related incident, from a handgun gunshot than you are from a rifle gunshot. And you're more likely to die from a blunt object, from being hit with a fist, than you are to be killed by a rifle. 660 people that year were killed with hands or fists, or feet, like Bruce Lee, right? How about the idea that rifles are inherently more dangerous? Of course, rifles have a greater muzzle velocity. Of course that's true. That's what rifles are made for, but that is not what is predominantly used in crime. And as for school shootings, the idea that school shootings are on the rise is also not true. There was a study that came out just in the last couple of days showing that the number of school shootings has actually been in significant decline. Since 2012, according to the Gun Violence Archive, 138 people have been killed in school shootings. That does include the Parkland Massacre, and it includes any incident that took place on a school campus during times where students or faculty were on the ground. So somebody shot themselves. It wasn't even a mass shooting. It's 138 people total. So between 15 and 20 people per year are killed on school grounds, which means that 2.6% of all youth homicides occur at school. Your child is about 40 times more likely to die from getting into your medicine cabinet or into some other household product than they are from being shot after you drop them off at school, as Leon Wolf points out over at the Blaze. And according to researchers at Northeastern University, mass school shootings are extremely rare. 4 times as many children were killed in schools in the early 1990s as they are today. None of this is to make light of anything that's happened. None of this is to suggest that every school shooting is not a tragedy, but it is to suggest that the lie that is being promulgated out there, that there's a school shooting every day in America. You heard this. There were 18 school shootings, 18 mass shootings in the first month of the new year. It's just not true. It's just a lie. It's made up. Every town for gun violence, for gun safety, puts this stuff out, and it's not true. It's statistically false. Mass shootings more broadly are also not happening all that often in the United States. In fact, on a per capita basis, the United States does not rank number 1 in deaths from mass shooting in the Western world. Okay, actually, the United States ranks 11th. From 2009 to 2015, here are countries that ranked above the United States in mass shooting deaths rates per million. Norway, Serbia, and France. Mass shooting frequency, we rank number 12, after Austria, France, Switzerland, and Norway. And here's the thing about using mass shootings as a proxy for this discussion anyway. Mass shootings are a really bad way to go about having a gun control discussion because they are not representative of gun violence in totality. The victims tend to be younger. The victims tend to be more racially diverse. The perpetrators tend to be a little bit younger. Most gun murder victims are between the ages of 15 to 34, for example. 2/3 of those gun victims are black in the United States. Okay, in mass shootings, it's racially diverse. So why are we using mass shootings as a proxy to have a discussion about broader gun violence? It doesn't make any sense, except that the media like to choose hotspot, really ugly incidents they can focus on so that then they can claim that all of us don't have sympathy for people who were killed. So Alyssa Milano came out and tweeted about the Second Amendment. And what she tweeted about the Second Amendment was a particularly stupid thing. So what she tweeted out was, she said, also popular in 1791, the year the Second Amendment was adopted. And then it's a list of things. Slave